The Fall of the Philippines and the Bataan Death March, a harrowing World War II chapter. When Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, their forces also struck across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, including the American-held Philippines. Within hours, airfields near Manila were bombed, crippling much of General Douglas MacArthur's air power before it could even take off. Over the following weeks, Japanese divisions pushed onto Luzon, forcing US and Filipino troops to retreat south to the Bataan Peninsula. Manila, declared an open city to spare its population, soon fell to the invaders. Despite limited reinforcements and dwindling supplies, the defenders of Bataan held out longer than many anticipated, under constant artillery fire, aerial bombardment, and tropical hardships. Their objective wasn't necessarily to secure a decisive victory, but to buy precious time for the United States to regroup, a heroic yet doomed stand that lasted until April 1942. On Bataan, dysentery, malaria, and malnutrition proved as deadly as Japanese shells. Supplies promised from the mainland United States never materialized in the volume needed, in part because the catastrophic losses at Pearl Harbor made quick resupply virtually impossible. Rations were cut repeatedly, forcing soldiers to subsist on watery rice and whatever wild game they could catch. Still, morale held for a time, bolstered by the tenacity of Filipino and American troops unified in a desperate stand. Ironically, Japan's high command also struggled with logistics, hampered by miscalculations about how fiercely Bataan would resist. Yet the defenders' position became unsustainable. By early April, battered and starved, they faced an all-out Japanese assault that shattered their perimeter. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward P. King Jr., knowing further bloodshed was futile, agreed to surrender over 70,000 troops, one of the largest capitulations in American military history. What came next etched Bataan into infamy. Expecting a swift process of relocation, the starving and exhausted captives instead were marched some 60 to 70 miles in the tropical heat, from the peninsula to Camp O'Donnell. This Death March, as survivors would later call it, became a symbol of Japanese brutality during World War II. Guards who themselves had supply issues offered prisoners little water or food. Any captive who collapsed or lagged behind risked summary execution. Many were beaten or bayoneted. Bodies fell by the roadside, and small acts of mercy by local Filipinos, throwing scraps of food or water, were met with severe punishments from the guards. The exact death toll is debated, but thousands perished along the route, with more dying from disease and malnutrition once they reached the squalid prison camp. News of the Bataan Death March inflamed American public opinion, hardening resolve to defeat Japan at any cost. The cruelty of the march was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern in which Japanese forces, adhering to a harsh warrior ethos, considered surrender dishonorable. They regarded prisoners of war with contempt, seeing them as men who had forfeited all rights by failing to fight to the death. From the Japanese perspective, any logistic shortfall that prisoners suffered was of lesser concern compared to their own frontline needs. This attitude was shaped by the same militant code that urged Japanese soldiers never to be taken alive, a code that clashed violently with Western concepts of the Geneva Convention and POW treatment. As a result, the systematic neglect of prisoners wasn't simply an oversight, it was, in part, a consequence of the Imperial Army's indoctrination. Captives on Bataan witnessed this cultural collision in the most brutal terms possible. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, General MacArthur had been ordered by President Roosevelt to evacuate to Australia, famously vowing, "I shall return." His departure left Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright in command, who would eventually be forced to surrender the island's stronghold of Corregidor in May 1942. The fall of the Philippines marked a significant triumph for Japan, giving them strategic control over shipping lanes and bases that extended their reach into the Pacific. Yet even in victory, the Bataan campaign and its grim aftermath signaled a moral and psychological blowback. Allied propaganda seized on accounts of the Death March to paint Japan as an inhumane foe, galvanizing enlistments and fueling demands for unconditional surrender. For the thousands who survived captivity, the horror continued inside prison camps. Malnourishment, disease, and forced labor decimated their ranks. Some prisoners were shipped to Japan or other territories as slave labor aboard what became known as hell ships, where conditions were equally deadly. Many would not see freedom until Japan's final capitulation in 1945, emerging skeletal and traumatized, testaments to human endurance under unimaginable conditions. Their accounts, once publicized, contributed to war crimes charges against Japanese officers and further solidified the narrative that Japan had waged a cruel and barbaric conflict in the Pacific. When MacArthur finally returned in late 1944, leading an American amphibious invasion to retake the Philippines, memories of Bataan loomed large. The liberation that followed was celebrated by locals who had suffered under harsh Japanese occupation. At the same time, the fighting in places like Leyte and Luzon proved as relentless as ever, with kamikaze tactics introduced against Allied ships. In many respects, the recapture of the Philippines foreshadowed the bloody slog the Allies expected to face if they invaded Japan's home islands. The Bataan Death March thus became not only a story of wartime atrocity but a foreboding sign of how fanatically the imperial forces might defend their homeland. Over the decades, the story of Bataan and its infamous Death March cemented itself in American and Filipino collective memory. Monuments and annual commemoration marches have emerged, ensuring that survivors' voices are not lost to history. Many historians argue that while Pearl Harbor symbolized the beginning of war for the US, Bataan symbolized the cost of underestimating Japan and the harrowing consequences of isolation and ill-preparedness. It also reflected the brutality stemming from a code of warfare that disdained the concept of surrender. For Japan, the Death March stands as a stark example of how deeply the Imperial Army's moral framework had diverged from international humanitarian standards, an issue that would resurface repeatedly as Allied troops uncovered more POW camps across Asia. Today, echoes of Bataan serve as cautionary tales about the darkest reaches of war. Stories from survivors remind us that when supply lines break down and leadership fosters contempt for captives, extreme human suffering follows. The subsequent war crimes trials, where some Japanese officers were held accountable, underscored the global rejection of such treatment of prisoners. Yet the lessons from Bataan resonate far beyond the legal sphere. They remind modern nations of the thin line between disciplined warfare and barbarity, and how easily that line can be crossed in the heat of conflict and under the sway of unforgiving ideology. The Bataan Death March was not the single largest atrocity of World War II, but its tragedy lies in how vividly it captured the cruelty and dehumanization that can emerge when an invading force sees its captives as lesser than human. By the time American forces staged their dramatic return, the Philippines had endured years of occupation and guerrilla struggles. The savage fighting to retake Manila left the city in ruins, one of the worst urban battles of the Pacific War. But with liberation came closure for some, as Allied investigators uncovered details about the Death March and sought justice against its perpetrators. In the broader arc of the Pacific Theater, Bataan fits alongside events like the fall of Singapore or the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, illustrating that World War II in Asia was not just about big naval engagements and island conquests. It was also a land war of epic scale and devastating human cost, culminating in revelations that shaped war crimes legislation and global consciousness regarding POW treatment for generations to come. Remember Bataan became both a rallying cry and a solemn vow. Never again would the United States allow its soldiers to be undersupplied and abandoned to certain defeat. At the same time, the memory spurred intense re-evaluation of how enemies are treated in captivity, a moral reckoning that continues to influence international law. For the Filipino people, Bataan stands as a testament to their resilience, an emblem of unity between US and Filipino forces, and a sobering reminder of the sacrifices endured for eventual freedom. In that sense, the Bataan Death March was more than just a wartime atrocity. It was a moment that revealed the extremes of both heroism and cruelty that can unfold when nations clash on a grand scale. Subscribe to Legends of the Battlefield for more stories of brilliant tactics and legendary leaders.